welcome everybody. Great to see so many people I know and friends and colleagues joining on the call. And also just to reassure you of a couple of things that we want to try and make sure this session, when Joe and I talked about putting it together, is valuable for you in your organizations and in your outlook looking ahead for this busy summer. And just as a little bit of context from myself, we've got a very wonderful set of three experts at various different levels and strata in the ecosystem which we all enjoy in the defence sector in the UK, and it's deliberately so you can all see and hear different perspectives, because that's what it's all about. If you did dial in to get the complete expose of SDR, which isn't yet of course public, you'll be a bit disappointed, but I can tell you that there's an awful lot of discussions going on. And I would just say, and I put out a message earlier to some people in my role as the co-chair of the MOD's integration working group run by TDI, which is 600 members, that I am seriously impressed at the minute. And there's an awful lot of great thinking, great development, and the change, the like of which I've not seen in anything in my 30 plus years in defence. So I think there's the great enthusiasm. We all have to put our shoulder to the wheel. Negativity is not going to be welcome, nor throwing rocks. We've got to look forward. And that's the aim of this session, try and see what can be improved, what can be done better once SDR is out. Because the final point really is SDR is not going to answer everything. It's going to set out the way forward, the aspiration, the intent. But that's about it. So I'll quickly introduce the three guest speakers we've got to join me today, and I'm very honoured and grateful to them. We've got Sarah Sharkey from ProLinks, who's not only a successful BD director there at ProLinks, but also has a distinguished military career. Many of you will know Sarah from that time, not only in Defence Digital, but before in the career there in the Royal Signals and the technical part of the Army. And her viewpoint will be particularly important because of what ProLinks do as a UK organisation, doing secure data and a range of other aspects as well in the market. I'm also delighted to welcome Stuart McKean, who's from 923. He's the founder and is an SME that has grown to be a really important force in, again, sovereign-based data security and connectivity for their customers, which are in the very sensitive space in the UK. But also from Stuart's point of view, again, as a former military expert himself, a former aviator. I'm sure he won't tell us that. But the fact is, what we can also do is rely on his view, because I really want to hear it today from himself and our other guests about SMEs, and we'll cover that in a moment. But also delighted to welcome from across the pond today, Ben's very kindly joined us. Ben Baker, many of you will know from Lockheed Martin, who again is not only involved in the strategic development for Lockheed Martin in the UK, but also has been involved in a lot of other groups, not least also because of his, again, former military career as an operational infantry officer, and well qualified too. So thank you to the three of you for joining today. If I can kick it off on the first question, just to talk about SMEs, because this is something that I know all of us have probably spoken before, everyone on the call, we've never got it right. We've never got it right yet about how can we get the SMEs integrated more. Great innovators, and the take up of innovation is not quite enough. So I'll ask Stuart first. What is it about SME involvement that is perhaps misunderstood, and what do you think could be done better post SDR? What are you looking for, Stuart?
Thanks, Chris. I wasn't even going to mention aviation. I was going to start with, as an SME founder, I can tell you I work for a living now, which is, I'm sure many will appreciate. Look, I think the thing I would always start off with, I think there's a misunderstanding when people spout SME. It's a very overused term, and I had to go and clarify this myself to make sure that I was saying the right thing. But an SME can still be up to 26 million and 250 staff. That's a lot of people, and that's a lot of turnover. Yet they are deemed to be an SME. And yet I think everyone perceives SME to be small, in the garage, in the back bedroom, trying to deliver stuff and build stuff. And I think it's a very overused term. I think there's a huge amount of capability in the SME market. And I don't think we're always perceived correctly. I think there's a strong perception every SME needs investment and needs backing, when I don't think that's the case at all. I think there's a lot of SMEs with a lot of credibility, a lot of history and experience, and Sarah can certainly talk about the history of ProLinks. Been around a lot longer than us. There are many organizations that have been around a long time that know what they're talking about, but there's always a a perceived perception of them, and couple that with, they need money and risk. And I think there's a lot of SMEs that really aren't a risky option, but are certainly seen and deemed to be. And if you look at the procurement rules, of course, SMEs, there are certainly some programs that, certainly we just wouldn't bid on, just because of our size, not because of our capability. And then that's where I think SMEs and partnerships and working with others and collaboration with other SMEs, partnerships, I think is certainly the way forward, particularly in defence, because the reality is we're not going to win the big defence prime contract bids. We have to work with others. So yeah, I think there's a perception problem with SMEs. And Sarah, I don't know if you agree or disagree, but I certainly feel like we get lumped into you're an SME.
Yeah, I agree. What do you think, Sarah?
I completely agree. There is a view that SMEs are doing the innovative, creating AI in their garage, and actually is how you contract with them. But I think it's interesting how many times Ben Healy mentioned UK business in his recent KCL speech. And actually many UK business are medium-sized companies that are UK British business, and actually they do, as Stuart has said, have a wealth of experience and very much connected to the UK mission as well. I really welcome the work that's happening around the SME hub. That's kind of starting to go at pace. They're in the design phase at the moment, and I think there's probably others on the call who are involved in that. So they've reached out quite widely to get that up and running, and I like the fact they're co-creating that with SMEs. And so really interesting to see where that would take us. I do get very frustrated with the relationship between innovation and which is seen as the route for SMEs to get into defence. And I mean, personally, I have found innovation in defence to just be deeply frustrating. I think a huge amount of funding goes into the very early part of that, which is the POCs and have some seed corn funding. I think DASA posted just this week that they've 461 SMEs, and I'd love to know how many of those have actually then turned into any kind of core activity without having just been immediately bought by a prime somewhere. So it's about how you create that ecosystem. And I think for me, those two things, innovation and SMEs, is how does defence build the bridges to allow SMEs to properly connect with a little bit more of an acquisition model that is really understanding of how SMEs need to have a bit shorter timelines, be paid on time. Really important to an SME. If you aren't paid for a year, that's pretty critical, and that does happen. Just really understanding the context around how SMEs need to be able to be supported and behaved would be like to see the acquisition model coming out of the SDR.
And I think we'll touch on that last Chris, part in a minute. Go for it, yeah.
Yeah, Joe, just to add to that, what Sarah said, I think there's an element of SMEs have to sort of get off their arse and understand how to work in defence. But I also agree that defence having the ability to set those boundaries and understanding, how to partner. What does partner really look like? What does that really mean? And what do you have to do? Because if you want to work in the defence supply chain, not just MOD, but defence in the wider context, you've got to jump through a lot of hoops, and you need to understand that. So MOD and the SDR can set up these great new hubs. It's about giving some direction, but you still got to do the work. You still got to go and get prepared. You still got to get all the certifications. You've got to be insured correctly. And even just saying the word partnering and working with, whether it's another SME or a prime, even that takes a huge amount of effort and time, and it shouldn't be underestimated.
That's right.
And I completely agree with Sarah. When we talk about innovation and startups, it's like, oh, that's dead easy. We can give them loads of help. Well, what about the scale-ups? What about those that have been established for a long time, and those that actually they don't perhaps need the startup piece, but they do need the support in that scaling up and taking what is perhaps a service proposition and making it into a solution across a much wider piece. And it is difficult. It is not easy, and I would agree. I don't think there's going to be any utopia coming out of the SDR, and that here's all the answers.
I think well, we're interesting to see what Ben thinks, because I wonder whether, having owned SMEs as well and founded them themselves, not quite as successful as yours, Stuart, but there's ones there which have done very well, and I think it's like without the effort and work is immense. And I know that the primes especially have really looked hard at this, and I know there's one or two things been out. I know Lockheed Martin, your prime, you're representing and work with, you do a lot. Is there anything there you can offer about this partnership aspect from the other side of the fence, Ben, and also perhaps what's going on in the States, if we know, are they doing something we could replicate better?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, it's coming back to Stuart's point about perception and language, I think is quite important, because this can come across as quite binary, the sort of big primes and guys in their garage. And of course, the reality is it's a lot more nuanced than that. And what you've got to provide anything is a blend, you know, behind all our stuff are SMEs. And it's interesting how that can get lost, and I think if it does, it can obscure some of the wider underlying issues. I think on partnerships, absolutely. I mean, I certainly speak for Lockheed, and we're no different than others. We've got our own SME framework, SME Unite, which is active and well regarded. And I think it's just showing that, and it's not just with you know, SME small, but I think there is definite trend to do more working with others, partnerships, and some of them can be quite novel as well. So I think that's definitely a trend, and I think that will continue beyond the SDR. And then finally, just to Sarah's point on the acquisition models, I think with defence reform coming, I think we'll see, you know, much more recognition of the need for different acquisition pathways. Traditionally, both in terms of mindset and sort of legal framework, commercial approach, it's been all about platforms, and therefore naturally better fits a good old-fashioned prime. I think there's a recognition now, and this is certainly something, this is a trend, NATO and the States, that you need different acquisition pathways, which hopefully will mean that the right pathway is there for the right type of business or the right type of combination of businesses.
Absolutely, that's really useful. I think something for those people who want to put things into the chat or questions to think on. We're going to move it on a bit, but just on that last bit to think is, it's always a paradox to me as a former operational officer myself, as we do it brilliantly in operations. We have liaison staff, we have lots of things to make sure moving parts move more smoothly. We rarely seem to get it right, and I wonder whether that resourcing model from operational efficiency, which we do very well in the UK, could be looked at, and that need for commercial reform. I think we've all heard it in the last 4, 10, 15 years, and I think that will come back again and again. We're going to move on and just look at this, the second point about sovereignty. I'm going to come to Sarah first and just ask about sovereignty, because the issue is that the balancing of sovereignty, but also it's such a big issue and an important issue now, as we know, because it's not just about security and having our national security place there, but it's also about growth. We want to make sure we can look after our own rather than outsource everything to another state who may be doing something else. So there's a sort of a two-pronged attack, but balancing sovereignty, and how can we do that better, Sarah?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Obviously, since moving to Prolinx and being here as the strategy director, and Prolinx is a secure sovereign cloud company, part of our USP is that kind of real UK kind of backstop, if you like. And so that kind of subject of sovereignty has been one I've been doing a lot of thinking about. And it's been really kind of obviously emphasised recently with what's happening in sort of the geopolitical world. But we also know that we don't operate independently as a defence, and even our defence companies are often very multinational in their makeup, with franchise models and sort of local UK entities of their businesses. And I'm starting to think about it in kind of two perspectives. One is around the enabling technologies that allow the protection of data in order to be able to have a sovereign wrap around data. So actually, it doesn't really, you know, the nirvana, isn't it, is complete data-centric integrity, complete sort of SASE models and zero trust models with all the right IDAM controls around it. So that data can be anywhere in the world, doesn't matter, could be on any infrastructure in the world, doesn't matter. And it's entirely sovereign because you've got all the sovereign wraps, you know, UK eyes only, whatever else needs to be around it. We are, of course, a million miles away from that in anything apart from beautiful laboratory greenfield sites. And defence is very much not a greenfield site. There's a huge amount of legacy, a huge amount of obsolescence that needs to be driven around. So I think while we need to be, well, really hopefully the SDR will emphasise that, and then we're going to talk about integration and those sort of technologies subsequently. But, you know, to really kind of derive those enabling services so that give commanders and warfighters the agility at the edge with the control and the access that they need, to give them that kind of sovereignty. But it's also around how do they interoperate, and that identity service will allow them to interoperate. But I also think we need to think about sovereignty in terms of layers. I'm starting to think about it almost like an ISO stack, where at one end you want to be completely sole UK, all the way from the business to the model, to the location, to the company, to the influence is all entirely UK, because there's a kind of a complete left of arc. But actually, as you move through the different kind of models, you can go 2 eyes, UK only, NATO, bilats, trilats, European, US. How do we create those meshes to enable those to be very dynamically created and move through? And I think it's a hybrid approach, particularly today, before we can get to that nirvana of technology. How do we ensure sovereignty, or international relationships by maintaining countries' sovereignty through a different hybrid model, where you've got those different types of services, but understanding and being much more mindful about what the business is, where the data sits. It's not just geography, it's also about control and access.
Yeah,
Quite complex.
Yeah, it is. Well, I think you could do a whole webinar on that one, couldn't we? But I think the important thing for people today listening, and so that the message there, and again, Stuart, when you think about my thought on that, is yes, the answers there are available. It just needs an awful lot more closer collaboration now to make sure that the MOD has those systems and understands the systems that are needed to get that sovereignty to be in place, but not in any way compromise our efficiency.
Yeah, and I think Sarah hit the nail out. It's complex, right? If it was as easy of just going, oh, I'm sovereign and you're not, it would be very easy. It doesn't work like that. And of course, if you throw in, and I would say not quite perception, but it's a very overused term, sovereign. And sovereignty and data residency are 2 different things. And a lot of, particularly, dare I say, American-owned organizations are claiming, sovereignty, but said the US tech giants. And that's not, I'm not anti-US tech giants. They're a fact that the global tech providers of the world will be around and will be part of that solution.
That's right. Yeah.
So
that's right. Yeah.
Claiming sovereignty, I think, needs to be unpicked somewhat, and it comes back to what is it you're trying to do? What do you need? Do you need data residency? Do you need your directors of the company providing the service to be UK resident? There's a whole raft of complexity around sovereignty and residency, and unpicking all that, and then the supply chain and who you use in the supply chain. I think Sarah hit the nail on it. It is hugely complex, but again, a much overused term that sovereignty, I think, is used. I'm not saying dismissing it. I completely agree.
I understand. Yeah, and so more work needed, and I think that's something post SDR which will have to be thrashed out. And just I'll come to Ben on the next point. Actually, we're going to talk about interoperability and connectivity, and ask Ben some views on that. But before I go, the reason why I put this picture behind me is to remind us all that there is a parliament and a government involved in a national issue, and all other 26 government departments of state, in my experience, covering a lot of that estate there in my role, doesn't tend to make it quite so complicated. Yes, MOD has got to do an awful lot of complex deployments, something else, but I think sometimes it's back to how can we make it less complicated? How can we keep it simple? But we will move on quickly onto the next point, which is about a very simple question, it seems, but again, we could do a whole webinar on it. But I've asked Ben just to touch on this for us about integration. Is the big aim now of what we've seen that in what's been announced about SDR and pre-announcements. Integration is what it's going to be at, and CDS, so I understand, is going to own this, which is therefore it's going to happen. Interoperability and connectivity. How can we see this going to be better in terms of what things are needed to make that better, Ben?
Hi, Chris. Thanks. Yeah, obviously we're still pre-announcement on SDR, but there've been some pretty heavy hints that the future is getting, in terms of deployed forces, the future is getting beyond the joint force to genuinely making an integrated force, not just talking about it. I think, as we all know, that's going to be reflected in the home base by the new structures, the defence reform. But what we really need to do is then start seeing that reflected in the way that operations are approached, and ultimately capability is procured. And I think that the idea is that, you know, there are going to be some good benefits from that. I think this is some of the practical realities aside from the cultural, and so much of this is about people. And Chris, I know you're very passionate about that. But some of the technical realities of making this link back to exactly the discussion that we've just had. Operational sovereignty is a critical one. The vision for the integrated force, of course, is not just land, sea, and air. It's joint enablers, it's academia, it's industry, and critically, it's other partners across government, and then other partners around the world. Trying to stitch that all together is a technical issue and a cultural issue. But I think the key lesson, you know, integration, just like some of these other terms, is it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I think the key lesson from it all is, what is the battlefield or operational problem you're trying to solve? And then you work back from that to work out what your benefits are of integrating the various different aspects to make it bigger than the sum of the parts. Then once you've done that, you can then get it into the plug and play nature of enabling that technically, and hopefully that you've got that cultural base that should enable that to go as seamlessly as possible.
Okay, that's really useful. I think just on that, and I'll just ask Sarah also, from your background before and your military experience, but also now in industry and the role in ProLinks, I'm just amazed constantly as to how little awareness, we assume awareness is there of all the different technology types, the capabilities out there. How can we increase that awareness on both sides? How do we get that interaction going?
It's a challenge, isn't it? Because we know that increasingly, I mean, particularly in some of the digital teams, that the civil servants are getting stripped out, or have been stripped out over the last 5 to 6 years, and there are a huge amount of contractors now quite embedded in these teams, and they change over, so that knowledge is quite transient sometimes. I think it's really going to take kind of a bit of a concerted decision making. So I'm really hoping the SDR is going to try and focus on the enablers for the core to provide the enablers, to allow the edges, to allow the Army, Navy, the RAF, the frontline commands to actually. I love the plug and play, Ben. We need to be able to provide the network underneath, which everyone can then plug and play in, with lots of different services and lots of different capabilities that can then exchange, use that network and exchange it together. I think we still tend to focus on huge one-size-fits-all solutions and spend a lot of time building a one-size-fits solution. I think we're probably seeing that around some of the really big services which are coming out of the core, whereas we all know that TLBs are being far more agile and are moving on so far, but then they can't scale. And there's something in the middle there to allow that sort of that interoperability together. I mean, certainly when I was serving, the intent was to bring an identity service in, a cloud service in, which could then be consumed, and to move everybody else up the stack to focus on business need. But I think we just keep going around the boil on that kind of big program versus enabling agility.
Yeah, it's useful. And I think what I'll do is, because in the interest of time, because I do want to make sure that questions can come in from everybody, I'll move us on. I'll just touch on the next one. I wanted to make sure that we just also talk about regulation, because there's a rise in threat and risk and capability and complexity. There's also a rise in regulation. That's sort of expected, because there's an awful lot of regulation increasing in the US and also in the EU and the UK, because we're now, of course, outside the EU. We have to come in line with that. So the Cyber Resilience Bill, again, for all those listening today, please let's us all make sure that we are tracking what's going on there, because effectively the liability and the scope is being widened for regulatory inaction by actors, and that's going to include the defence sector. We're going to come on to a bit more about that in the defence sector in the next point, but I just wanted to make sure that people are tracking the Cyber Resilience Bill. We're going to come in sometime this year. There's an awful lot of interaction going on with Tech UK, I know, who are normally on point for those sort of things, and I'm doing that in one of the roles I do. But we just have to remember there's also the reporting needs, the managed service provision needs, all going to come into scope. So there's quite a lot of increased regulation, and that's something that will be part of all of our commercial defensive capabilities that we need to have, because those punitive fines and other things which will be run by the ICO are going to be something that has to be looked at commercially. So it's just an interesting thing to make sure we're all discussing those in our own companies as we go. I'm going to leave that one in the interest of time and move on to our last and perhaps most important question about the people that we're all sat in, most of us, the defence supply chain and the resilience of it. And what can we do to make sure post SDR, what needs to happen to make sure that if industry is going to become part of this whole set now of defence much more actively, how can we make sure we're not a weakness? So the resilience of that, how can we make sure that the supply chain is more resilient? So, and I'll ask Stuart first, actually, say about your company, how would you see that things need to be assisted, and where do you see it as your responsibility for resilience?
So I think risk and resilience sit hand in hand, and the reality of any supplier in the defence supply chain is you are a risk, and that can be both financial, it can be technical, there's many different parts to it, but the reality is you've got to reduce the risk, and by being more resilient, hopefully you are then not the weakest link in that supply chain. And let's be honest, the defence supply chain, and whilst we might favour the SME community, it will be primes and partners, and it goes from everything in between. So the reality of our positioning for us is very much understand what we deliver, and consider the worst case. On everything we do, how can we be more resilient? Whether it's people, process, or technology, you've just got to apply that resilience and risk, and understand your risk, because we all carry it one way or another. It's an absolute fact, and it doesn't matter if you're the biggest prime in the world or the smallest business in the world, you have some form of risk that you need to mitigate. So for me, it's really that understand where you fit in the chain. That supply chain, I think, is really critical. And I think, just to go back to a point Ben made before, I think one of the single most important parts of resilience, and where we need to really look at within the supply chain, comes back to culture. And that is absolutely critical to the supply chain. And if we don't have a culture of, oh, not me, that won't happen here, we will really just put ourselves more and more at risk, and we certainly won't be making the UK more resilient if we don't. And that's part linking to the bill that you mentioned as well. It's all about making it.
And Sarah, did you want to mention, just Sarah, on DCC, because there's this new regulation going to come in terms of the defence part. It's only about a week old, so we're not expecting all of us to get our heads around it yet. But the fact that Defence has gone out and said they've got their own measures now, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I thought it's quite interesting to see they're kind of working with ISME to develop a new certification for supply chain. ISME a new certification, the DCC, to kind of evidence that you've met a certain amount of controls, 3 different levels. We've done an initial analysis of it in ProLinks, and it seems to align really closely with JSP. I think it's 158. I don't memorise my JSPs, and so a lot of the controls are already there. And it may be relevant to cascade some of those controls down the supply chain, so they don't have to do the full sort of interconnectivity thing. But I think from an SME angle, it's yet another thing, right? It's yet another hurdle, and it's also, but probably broadly welcomed, because putting that focus on that whole end-to-end supply chain. And certainly, many of our clients now, who, as in defence business clients, they are increasingly mindful of their supply chain, and starting to use products that Stuart's mine and others to kind of extend their networks down the supply chain, because the infiltration points, and we've just seen Marks and Spencers and Co-op go into kind of absolute turmoil. Yeah, how do you secure that? Do you trust, or do you provide them a service? And this kind of really, really interesting. I think the UK resiliency, what's in those artifacts is quite interesting as well, isn't it? How do you guarantee that whole end-to-end supply chain? Do you know what your supply chain looks like? But I'm encouraged to see a lot more focus on supply chain within digital in defence.
I would just add though, Chris.
Yeah.
I mean, what I would say is disappointing about DCC, and I get where defence is coming from a resilience perspective. However, it's a point in time certification. We've spent years moving away from the old accreditation, and here we are now going back to a set of controls based on the Cyber Essentials scheme. Where's the principles-based risk mitigation that we've been talking about, and that's come out of NCSE for the last 5-10 years, and yet we seem to be going backwards to a set of anyway. So I get the whole trying to make the supply chain better and more resilient. I'm unsure that this is doing that.
It'll be workable. Okay, useful. Okay, Ben, unless you've got anything to add on that one, very happy to move on to the questions. Happy? Okay, so we'll move on to the questions. I was going to ask Joe if you've got anything you've particularly caught your eye in the chat while we've been chatting, anything to start us off. If not, I can happily do that, Joe.
So there's been a couple of questions that have come in. I think Phil and I believe that someone else mentioned it as well. Yeah, Mike. So a couple of questions just in and around the sovereignty piece, and kind of with the last sort of few months events with the US, can we really still trust the US, particularly with our data?
Yeah, understood. Okay, I mean, there's something, I mean, I'll kick off because I work for a very large, like most of the cyber connectivity companies. And of course, we must remember a lot of IT all comes out of pretty much California. The reality is, I would say yes. And I think even though there's been some turbulence there, the reality is the US can't fight alone and won't want to fight alone. And therefore, whatever there may have been in posturing recently, politically, I still feel the answer is yes, although it has caused, you're absolutely right to raise it, and I saw the chat points there. It is quite difficult. I don't know if, Ben, you've got anything just to add, because you've got a unique perspective and you're sat over the pond at the moment, but in terms of what would be your view of that, in terms of that UK and then US company interface?
I think, and it's already been mentioned, it's not binary. And defining the sovereignty of companies, if that makes sense, and the provenance can be difficult. I think so LM, for example, LM UK has UK IP and holds data in command and control systems that we do for UK armed forces, and that's the same across the piece. I think what it has done, though, absolutely, and again, there's a kind of common theme here. It connects up with the idea of integration, operational sovereignty. It's how you have to accept that. I think a trend in the future is going to be the ability to switch working with different people at different times, at different classifications, for different purposes. And I think we've already heard the phrase dynamic. And I think what this has probably done, and of course, yes, US is the obvious one, but there's plenty of examples going on, and not just in the aerospace and defence sector, just the need to really look hard at this. And I suppose it's an example of, a bit of maturity over this, is how you apply it. This is about how you apply it, how you fight it, and how you mitigate risk.
I would just add, Chris, I spoke to somebody at Cyber UK last week from NCSC and asked them this very question. So, do we trust, the hyperscalers? Do we trust the big US tech? And their answer was, I don't think we have a choice. We have to. Yeah. But I would also go back to the overarching principle of zero trust. Trust nobody, right? It's got to be proportionate, and back to risk and understanding your risk profile and your risk appetite become key. So yes, I think it's changed, but it hasn't changed, if that makes sense. That's on the offence, isn't it? If there ever was an answer.
Yeah, but I would probably go, meh. I think it's concentrated in mind. I think actually we're going to see a bit of a shift towards really understanding who's got the control, who's got the access, and who's influencing those outcomes to make sure they've got UK economic and sovereignty and security and data resiliency outcomes really at the heart of them. So we are certainly seeing a shift to our front door of people who do want a fully sovereign solution, because they want to not put all their eggs in one basket. So I absolutely agree. I think there's an event next Thursday, if anyone's interested. We're at Tech UK talking about sovereignty around data security and resilience with Ed McCutcheon, who's the chief architect for GDS, speaking on that very topic, just to explore what that kind of means in a changing world. And I think it has shifted, but I think that's probably a good thing, because I think we were getting too over-reliant. It's like anything, isn't it? Too much chocolate, too much anything. Yeah. I don't know why I use chocolate. We just need to have a balance, and they're getting the blend right.
That's useful. I think there's a point in the chat from a question from Dave Richardson as well at TDI, who's mentioned about teaming and getting together. So on that point then, so should we be doing more necessarily now? Do we expect more post SDR to be therefore much more in a sort of a NATO teaming environment rather than necessarily perhaps on our own? Because again, most of the operations we may look to do ahead will probably be on a NATO environment, or if not, certainly with the Americans involved as well. So do we see more teaming coming out and therefore international teaming, not just MOD and industry teaming? What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, definitely a trend, but it's very interesting. And I heard the NATO C2 Centre of Excellence director last week or the week before, and she was saying just how difficult a challenge it is to work across 32 nations. I'm just using that NATO as an example. And that's before you then start putting in 32 different operational sovereignty questions. And I think the same applies, if I'm honest, across businesses. And yeah, absolutely. Teaming is definitely a trend, big and small, new entrants, traditional players, Europe, US, other parts of the world. But I think the key thing to all of it is making sure that it's enabled and making sure that it's enabled securely. And hopefully one of the things that's going to come out of the SDR is a realization that to make some of the aspirations in terms of making industry part of, quote, the defence enterprise, there's a real acceptance that you're going to have to put some resource and some leadership attention into having those technical links as well as the people links to actually make this happen. Of course, that's even more critical as we're all moving to much more data models-based type procurement, where this is going to become very important to how things are not just procured, but also maintained and looked after through life.
If I could, I would agree, Ben. I think I totally agree with the comment in the chat. Teaming is absolutely the way forward, and certainly one of our key growth strategies is in around teaming and partnering. Who you choose to work with is part of our growth strategy. The thing I would just add caution to, and it's go back to that overbanded SME term. It can take a lot of time and effort to team and partner. And people don't quite realize, it's just an overused, well, just partner with, that prime over there. Oh, right. Well, I've got nothing else to do for the next 3 months, whilst you go through all the process. So being prepared in the supply chain of knowing how to work with primes and how to partner with others, doing that ahead of anything is definitely worth the effort. And it works both ways. And we've certainly seen it with the primes that they say they're ready to work with SMEs, and actually a lot of them aren't, to be truthful. But that you can't just blame the prime. You've got to be able to manage that as well. But yeah, teaming, growth, same thing.
Yeah. I'd like to see, I'm a big fan of MVP, so minimal viable products. So what I'd like to see is they're all great words, all great vision, but let's do it. Let's create some good teams together and then amplify how they're working together and perhaps use their code of conduct, or how they're used. I've seen it from both sides. So obviously I went from defence to Deloitte. So I went to big prime to very small SME. So I've seen it on all three sides of the fence now. And there are some just underlying principles around, business still has to make a profit. And when there's very little spend in government or in defence, because we've been waiting for SDR for however many months, those things become quite constrained. And the first thing that goes is the teaming, because you need to protect your own bottom line. There's IP from SMEs and from primes as well they want to protect. So there's some fundamental bits in there that teaming and just let's all share it doesn't really scratch the itch. And so having that commercial experience in defence is really important.
Yeah, it seems to be more about still at the same point of partnership and speaking together. Good point again from David Gwynn, who mentioned about inside the primes as well. And I've had experience this because it's just so big, some of these companies, and that's a large business risk always, is that it's just as complicated inside those companies or trying to get in them. So that teaming becomes different on another level. Ben, you're going to...
Yeah, I'd just say on teams, it's definitely an art and a science. And I think if you adopt that approach, it's quite useful. I think mutual understanding in detail is absolutely critical as well. And that works both ways from companies. And then just on your last point, Chris, you're absolutely right. I mean, of course, one of the trends, certainly a big initiative within Zoffy is internal teaming and novel combinations of different parts of the business internally that might not have been there previously. So it's a trend that runs intra as well as inter company.
That's very useful. I think, as also to reiterate my earlier point, is that when you're in an environment which is complex and you need to make communication go better, military on operations, we always have liaison officers and people to make that work, and it's resourced. So therefore, perhaps there's something from our discussion today that should we be resourcing both internally in industry for intra-industry discussion, and also for MOD to have those things. I know they are looking at this defence gateway, the portal is going to come in, as I've heard. I've seen some reports in the media about it, that they want to increase that ability to have that open door policy. Of course, we know it's going to be difficult, but it also must be done in those aspirant partnership organisations such as the primes as well. Useful. Just looking at the questions.
Just to add, to answer David's point there about the SME, that front door process, you know, dare I say, reinvented again. We've been through this before, the front door process and all these different initiatives. The challenge, of course, it doesn't matter who the prime is, whether it's an SME or a big one, somebody has a risk. It's just a fact. And you know, the MOD, the same as every other government department, will look at the risk associated with who's teaming. And if you haven't worked out who you're going to work with and who you're going to team with beforehand, doing it for a bid is generally not a good look. So you've got to do it well in advance. You've got to work out who you want to partner with. And I would say the key word for me is qualify. Qualify your partners. You know, you should qualify your clients, but you should qualify your partners. Who do you want to work with? You know, who do you want to partner with? And I would wholeheartedly recommend there's even an ISO standard, believe it or not, for collaborative working. 44,001, I think, is it, or 45? I can't remember, one of them. But there is an ISO standard that actually gives you a framework for working together. It's not overly difficult, but it is that just you've got to work out who to work with first, would be my view.
That's great. Well, Larry's just helped us in the chat. Thanks for that. And a couple of other ones from the chat were very useful. Mentioned about cyber resilience bill applying to defence. Actually, it's whether it's in or out of scope for the whole public sector is a bit of a discussion point with DCIT at the moment, the department dealing with the cyber resilience bill. The recommendation certainly from industry is yes, public sector's got to be in, therefore de facto defence should be in, but certainly the business end of it, the commercial end of it will be. It's also mentioned about cyber essentials, a question there I saw on the chat. Thanks for that. I mean, and that's accepted by NCSC. We were with them, a lot of us, last week at Cyber UK. That's work in progress. So people are listening. It has had some challenges, but I think we mentioned earlier those systems that are in place, and Sarah mentioned it about better to have DCC and something to go at as an SME rather than have to do it all yourself. I mean, there's always that, we will always knock a process, but better to have a process you can follow through than being told, get on with it yourself when you're a very small SME. There was a question from Phil Williams about ownership of hardware, and this is back to the switching on, switching off discussion. Actually, electronically, it's normally pretty good protocol to make sure you can turn on and off devices. It happens in banking all the time to make sure that's safe. It's about whether contractually or sovereign-wise that is a concern. Any thoughts on that on the panel about the ability? I mean, it's a normal electronic protocol to be able to do that, about whether things might change ahead about that.
Well, we certainly prefer to own our infrastructure. If you're going to deliver a service, I think having as much control as possible over the hardware enables you to provide another level of service. So from a business perspective, we own our own private cloud environments, and those network connectivity, you know, we manage that on behalf. And so I think, yeah, the more you can own the stack, the better, personally. But I also accept it's more expensive. Reassuringly expensive, as I was once told.
Absolutely. Sarah, any thoughts on that about the ability to turn on, turn off when we got our data moving around?
Well, it's just I was sort of trying to describe this ISO stack. It's the top of the pyramid, isn't it? You know, do you want to be able to turn up with the emergency fuel tanker to top up the generators that are keeping that data center and your bits, your racks in that data center, which have got your critical national infrastructure or mission necessary activities going on? And then can you also drive a Trinity node or whatever else is up to the back door and plug in and still access services? And this is where having medium companies that have got their own technology and their own data centers are probably more agile with a small a to be able to do that than perhaps some of the hyperscalers. And I mean, David asked a specific question about the UK sovereign solution. We don't have a UK hyperscaler, but I think actually companies like Stewart's, like ours, and other UK companies like us probably need to start working differently together. Think about how we can mesh that. And then how do we mesh that internationally as well? How do we create a European cloud mesh where you can have distributed data across and you hyperscale it through a mesh rather than a one-size big fits all solution? I don't know about anybody else, but I worry about the concentration of some of our data in terms of geography and where it is. I happen to live near one of them. So there's some other vectors here around dispersal as well and supply chain security by having a much more disparate supply chain.
That's useful.
Yeah,
Really
Chris, I just add to that, and I think one of the big lessons coming out of current conflicts, I think there's always a propensity to connect everything up and centralize it. Well, of course, now if you want to survive, you need to know when to disconnect and when to connect. And I think you can take that logic through that. You shouldn't talk about supply chains. You should talk about supply webs. And I think this is the same with data security, and perhaps some, it might not be as efficient. It might be more expensive. It might come with other issues, but better something than nothing. Because I think, it's interesting. We all talk about, allies or partners turning things on and off. Remember that we're now dealing with threat actors who are actively trying to undo everything that we're trying to achieve. So resilience, again, can often be seen as internal. Of course, it's all relevant to external actors who are trying to attack that resilience. So I think it's just quite an interesting way that as the technology matures, it's applying it in a consummate to the threat.
No, it's useful, very useful. And I think that's a good point actually for us to probably start to draw some of those thoughts together. So I'll try and do that for all of us. Really useful discussion and conversation there. I think that last point as well about the fact that we've seen a lot in modern conflict has changed things again. We are in an evolutionary business in defense and especially in digital defense at the moment. So this whole connectivity piece, we've heard today when we started off about SMEs and we looked at some of those challenges and we heard from our panel about that issue about it's not just doing that work is not just complex, but we need to make sure the partnerships needed to reduce that complexity and ease some of the burden on SMEs who are new to some of those growth areas. Those need to be better as well. We talked later, didn't we, about whether those pathways could be better done, that communication. That's a common theme that today I've heard about pathways. We talked about defence reform and how different acquisition pathways. I'm really glad it's probably the first discussion and webinar we didn't go down a superb red herring line there on commercial stuff. So thanks for that today from everybody and including on the chat, because we know that is work in progress. They're trying to do a lot from commercial acts to also reforming and taking risk based on the principle that perfect is the enemy of good enough. So we must be now, like Tom CS, the general in charge of Stratcom's deputy commander, saying that we must take more risk. We talked about sovereignty and about the drive to enabling success and those services, which Sarah reminded us, we need to enable those services to allow that to happen. So that's a whole system that needs to be built inside the MOD and also in industry to make sure that sovereignty can be understood and made better. And it's going to be something that will evolve post SDR. Today, we talked about integration and Ben reminded us of some of the complexities. And again, we could do a whole webinar on that interoperability, more partnerships, more awareness. How can we do that? How can we communicate more? We talked about resilience as well and about it was just risk, as Stuart said, but also planning as well. Try and make sure that planning is essential, but not planning on our own. We've got to now start looking as a supply chain. I've seen it done in the energy sector and other sectors very well. Maybe we need to look over the fence a bit more and change our culture. We talked about teaming. There were some good mentions in the chat about that as well, about how we can draw that together. And digitally, we mustn't beat ourselves up that there's an immaturity in our sector. We've only been going about 30 years in digital world. If you look at construction and oil and gas, the partnerships and the way of working is mature because they've had to do it for sometimes up to 100 years. So they're ahead of us. So we must give ourselves some grace there, but also get on with it and make sure that we are partnering and talking and discussing more. Less stovepipes, more teamship. And the last points there mentioned that Ben was mentioning a good point about we should talk about a supply web and how can we actually use that data distribution and the security of that web. It's not just a chain anymore, to improve ourselves. And that brings us on really to my last point before I hand back to Joe, is that SDR is not out now. The things we've referred to are largely things we've all seen in the media and open source and speculation, but we're getting the inference that it's going to be a change, a big change, a step change, we're told, and I believe that. And a lot of things, that's two summary points I'd say today: more partnership and certainly more communication is going to be needed to make those things work because it's complex. Joe, thanks so much. Back to you.